He kept on saying that with that kind of technology, you could convince people of almost anything.
As far as conspiracy theories go, very few have had as much of a life as the notion that NASA somehow faked the Apollo moon landing. In some ways, one can understand why people feel this way, as it was one of the most important events in human history and the only witness was a TV camera. Back then, people distrusted anything they couldn't see with their own eyes. And in the 70s, conspiracy theories started to get really popular, especially as far as the government went, with this being the era of Watergate. People no longer trusted authority, and into this fraught environment came Capricorn One, a sci-fi tinged conspiracy thriller that was one of the most popular films of 1978, but has since been largely forgotten, save for a small cult of devoted fans.
3, 2, 1.
Hi there, Dr. Calloway. Nice to see you. A funny thing happened on the way to Mars.
The film is directed by Best Movie You Never Saw favorite Peter Hyams, who also made Outland, 2010, Running Scared, The Relic, and a few other legit gems. The movie centers around a crew of astronauts who, on the eve of the first manned mission to Mars, are taken to a television studio by NASA and told that due to a faulty life support system, the mission would have failed. Due to a potential cut in funding, they proceed to fake the mission, with the astronauts being told that if they don't cooperate, their families will be killed.
There are people out there, forces out there, who have a lot to lose.
What happens is that the ship that they were on that was sent up empty actually burns up on re-entry, meaning that all the astronauts are supposed to be dead, so now NASA's gotta kill them.
We are dead. What? We're dead.
Sounds like a pretty good premise, right? Capricorn One is a real gem as far as movies of this kind go. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was a whole slew of movies produced by a financier named Lou Grade. These were technically independent films, but they were made on a pretty lavish scale with movie stars, and they were the precursors to companies like Coralco, which really came about in the 80s and 90s and were pretty huge for a while. One problem though, most of the Lou Grade movies, well, they sucked. In fact, people used to refer to him as low grade.
You look at what we've meant to this country. Nobody gives a crap about anything anymore.
He made some giant flops, including a Lone Ranger movie that was an even bigger flop than the Armie Hammer one.
Who is that masked man?
And featured another memorably named actor, this one named Clinton Spilsbury, in the lead, whose voice ended up being so bad it was redubbed.
Let him not be judged by his color, but by his heart, as a man.
An even bigger flop was Raise the Titanic, which was an early attempt to film Clive Cussler's Dirk Pitt novels. The movie was one of the most expensive films in the era, and was such a flop that Grade snapped, Raise the Titanic? It would have been cheaper to lower the ocean. One exception was Capricorn One, which was a major financial success.
Houston, this is Capricorn One. We have landed.
It was an unlikely hit as the two leading men, Elliott Gould and James Brolin, were in the middle of career slumps. Gould had been one of the biggest stars of the early 70s following MASH.
Oh no, here, take your shirt off and tell me where it hurts.
But he made a movie called A Glimpse of the Tiger that was shut down mid-production and basically didn't happen.
Something's wrong and I don't know what it is.
It damaged his credibility because the rumor at the time was that he had gone insane, which he swore, of course, wasn't true.
Yeah, you gotta be nuts too. And you're gonna need a crew as nuts as you are.
The fact that it was followed by a series of huge financial flops certainly didn't help matters, but around this time, he was largely working in Canada on movies financed by our tax shelters here, and also in Europe. For Brolin, he was just ending his run on Marcus Welby MD and was seen as a TV actor, and back then, people didn't really cross over from TV to films that much. The movie would be pretty good for him, leading to his biggest hit the year after, The Amityville Horror.
I'm coming apart! Oh, Mother of God, I'm coming apart!
Interestingly, both men have marriages with Barbra Streisand in common, with Gould married to her from 1963 to 1971, while Brolin was married to her from 1998 to, well, now. The rest of the cast was an unusual hodgepodge of 70s stars. Sam Waterston, who would become a beloved character actor.
I ever tell you the one about the guy who had a job giving enemas to elephants and
and the somewhat less beloved O.J. Simpson round out Brolin's crew,
I think I'm gonna throw up.
while Hal Holbrook plays the NASA bad guy.
They're grown-ups. It's gotten too big. It's in the hands of grown-ups.
What about our families?
They're flying back from the Cape to Houston. They're all together on the plane.
Brenda Vaccaro plays Brolin's wife. Karen Black is Elliott Gould's love interest.
Glad I'm not like you.
I have better legs.
But best of all is a cameo by Telly Savalas, who was riding high at the time as the beloved bald detective Kojak on TV.
You want to speak to somebody in charge? You speak at the both of them.
Savalas apparently only worked a day on this movie, but wow, what a day. He gets to play a crop duster who participates in the movie's best action scene, a hair-racing chase between a biplane and 2 helicopters, and also gets to essentially save the day. So as for the elephant in the room, what the heck is O.J. Simpson doing in this movie?
I think I'm gonna throw up.
Let's not forget that O.J. at the time was better known as a beloved football star rather than a murderer, but I digress.
I think I'm gonna throw up.
He was a popular pitchman in the era and had shown up in The Towering Inferno as a heroic security guard who rescues a kitten. He was trying to become an actor, and while Peter Hyams said that at first he really didn't want to cast him in the role, the two actually became friends, and Hyams actually turns up in O.J. Made in America, explaining why he cast Simpson and how he was shocked that Simpson eventually ended up, well, being a murderer.
I think I'm gonna throw up.
In fact, Hyams directed 2 murderers in roles, with him having worked with Robert Blake just a couple of years earlier. He admitted that this is a very, very strange distinction to have. Anyway, Capricorn One jump-started a solid career for O.J. Simpson until, killed his wife, right?
I think I'm gonna throw up.
One interesting thing about this movie is that despite them being portrayed as the movie's villains, NASA was all aboard for Capricorn One. They provided technical assistance, mock-up vehicles, and more, which is pretty amazing as they're portrayed as both dangerously inept and evil.
They're grown-ups.
The movie runs a shade too long at just over 2 hours, but overall it's a pretty neat conspiracy thriller. The cast is perfect as Brolin, Simpson, and Waterston all look like they could have walked off of a Wheaties box with their all-American looks. In fact, I think O.J. Simpson was on Wheaties boxes at this time. Elliott Gould is an interesting contrast, being more of a New York Jewish type, and the film really belongs to him as he uncovers the mystery.
I think I'm on to something. It could be your actual ball game.
Golly geez, Scoop, that sounds very interesting.
Something's wrong, something big. They know I'm onto it and they try to kill me.
If you only know Elliott Gould from Friends or as daffy older types like on Ray Donovan, you should really check out his 70s output with MASH, Long Goodbye, and California Split, plus The Silent Partner, all being pretty excellent movies. There's really no one like him. Imagine Adam Sandler if he didn't do comedies but did thrillers and dramas instead. That's kind of what you get with Elliott Gould.
My head hurts.
You look awful.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
The movie has some nifty action scenes, including the great biplane helicopter chase. It's all tied together by an amazing score by Jerry Goldsmith, with this being one of his finest works. The movie is very good, but the score is a masterpiece. Hyams, as usual, makes the movie impeccably crafted, with Bill Butler, who shot Jaws, being his DP. Now, Hyams did have a reputation for usurping his DPs and just shooting movies himself, regardless of who's credited, but this one doesn't have his usual look to it, and he wasn't quite the big director that he would become later. So I think that probably Butler at least shot most of this movie. It looks more like a Bill Butler movie than a Peter Hyams movie. One thing about Capricorn One is that it's really easy to find. Lou Grade's ITC went out of business in the mid-80s because all their movies were flopping, and the rights to his movies have bounced around a lot, and I suppose the package for them is pretty cheap given how awful about 95% of them are. You can find this movie streaming for free on Tubi TV, Peacock, Roku, and even Plex, which I had no idea actually streams movies, but hey, there you go, they got Capricorn One. I recommend checking it out because it's kind of an interesting addition to the best movie you never saw. A little bit older than we usually do, but I think one that a lot of you will probably really enjoy. But hey, don't take my word for it. Check it out and let us know in the comments what you think.
I think I'm gonna throw up.
One has to admire the ambition of making a sequel to perhaps the most influential science fiction movie of all time. And no, I'm not talking about Star Wars. I'm talking about Stanley Kubrick's 1968 classic, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Dumb. That's what it is.
It was the movie that forever changed what anyone thought science fiction film was capable of. Up to that time, it was mostly seen as kind of a kiddie genre or disposable, but 2001: A Space Odyssey was a cerebral masterpiece. So, how does one make a sequel to a film like that when, of course, Stanley Kubrick had no interest in ever doing a sequel? You'd go to the only obvious choice, director Peter Hyams.
This is crazy.
You bet it is.
Who had directed Outland and Capricorn One. Okay, well, perhaps not such an obvious choice after all, but I gotta say, a pretty inspired one because 2010, the year we make contact, is a really underrated movie, and it's this month's best movie you never saw.
3, 2, 1. Wypuściła rozdzielительные Balti.
Good morning, Dr. Chandra. This is Hal. I'm ready for my first lesson.
So this one picks up 9 years after 2001: A Space Odyssey. Dave Bowman, the astronaut who, of course, became the star child in 2001, has vanished, never to return. Keir Dullea played him in 2001 and would also play him in 2010. So in this movie, Discovery One's mission overseer, Heywood Floyd, who was the character in 2001 that was speaking to his daughter on a satellite phone, which everybody was amazed by, the fact that you could talk to somebody on a video screen, which of course we now do constantly.
We'll be able to talk to each other, see each other on television.
Heywood Floyd, played by Roy Scheider this time, is given the opportunity to take part in a joint USSR-US mission to see what went wrong. There's only one problem. The two countries are on the cusp of all-out nuclear war, and tension between the American and Soviet teams looks to unmoor an already impossible mission.
A Russian craft flown by Russians, carrying a few poor Americans who need our help.
So, this movie not only stars Roy Scheider, but also co-stars a young Helen Mirren, John Lithgow, Bob Balaban, and Keir Dullea, of course, returning from 2001. It has a really interesting score by David Shire, and it's written and directed by Peter Hyams. Crafting a sequel to 2001: A Space Odyssey definitely sounds like a fool's errand.
Dumb. That's what it is.
Being that it's one of the most acclaimed films ever made, in order to be judged any kind of success, the sequel would have to be some kind of masterpiece. In 1984, director Peter Hyams was coming off of the success of Capricorn One, which at the time was one of the most successful independent films ever made, and is definitely a little gem that's worth checking out. He had also done a couple of mid-level studio programmers, like The Star Chamber with Michael Douglas, which is a completely forgotten movie now, but is actually a lot of fun, and the underrated Outland, starring Sean Connery, in basically a sci-fi twist on High Noon. He decided he was going to give it a go, and it's actually not as crazy an idea as it sounds because author Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, had also written a well-received sequel to the book that the original 2001 was based on. And MGM, celebrating their Diamond Jubilee, gave Hyams a really healthy $28 million budget, which was comparable to, something like Return of the Jedi. With star Roy Scheider coming off of Blue Thunder, which was a huge hit in 1983, and co-star John Lithgow having recently earned back-to-back Oscar nominations for The World According to Garp and Terms of Endearment, it looked for a while like 2010 was going to be a solid hit, with Kubrick himself giving the film his reserved blessings. He even, in some kind of weird cameo, plays the Soviet premiere. Not actually in person, but there's a photo of Time magazine where the premiere is on the cover, and it's actually Stanley Kubrick. So Hyams said that he actually went to Stanley Kubrick, told him exactly what was going on, and wouldn't actually do the film unless he approved. And he didn't think that necessarily Stanley Kubrick was going to do it, but he said, sure, go ahead, I don't really care. He actually also told him not to be afraid and just to do your own movie, which I think was pretty solid advice because 2010 really does stand on its own. In fact, if you happen to think that 2001: A Space Odyssey isn't the masterpiece that everybody else seems to think it was, you still might like 2010. It really kind of does its own thing, and it's a cool little sci-fi movie of its own. Alas, 2010 was little more than a middling success at the box office. The reviews were respectful, if not overly enthusiastic, and contrary to popular opinion, the film was actually not a huge financial flop. It grossed a very decent, for 1984, $40 million, and it beat, the pants off of Dune at the box office, and it also did very well on the then nascent home video market. Even still, over the years, the film has kind of vanished into obscurity, not helped by the fact that, of course, the Cold War ended shortly after the film came out, and it made the premise of the US being on the verge of war with the Russians prematurely dated. So, in a lot of ways, 2010 has always kind of been a curio for fans. Now, I'm not going to make a case for 2010 being a movie that comes close to Kubrick's film. It's not. And I actually think that making a sequel to it was kind of a bad idea in the first place, because you really can't make a sequel to a genre-defining classic like that. It's just always a bad idea. It'd be like doing a sequel to Casablanca or Citizen Kane.
Dumb. That's what it is.
But Peter Hyams really does deserve some credit for making a pretty damn decent sci-fi drama that likely would be held in much higher esteem were it not a sequel to what a lot of people think is the greatest movie ever made. It's an interesting counterpoint to the quintessential 80s blockbuster, which always painted the Soviet villains as bloodthirsty maniacs.
Oh, sons of bitches.
Here, the conflict between the two nations is presented as mere ideology, and that when you get down to it, the Soviet astronauts and their American counterparts aren't all that different, finding common ground pretty early on.
Hey, would I lie to you?
In that way, the film is actually a convincing plea for peace, although it's certainly a bit quaint to see a movie set in 2010 where the political problems haven't evolved beyond the 80s. It helps that Hyams put together one heck of a good team, drawing in a much better than average cast, including Roy Scheider, who was still in his post-Jaws sweet spot as the quintessential Hollywood everyman. He's maybe a little too blue-collar to be playing the intellectual Haywood, but he makes for a likable hero. Helen Mirren as the Soviet captain also makes for an intriguing counterpoint, as the respectful if lightly adversarial relationship is well conveyed all throughout the film. I also appreciate the distinct lack of romance between the two, which would have been very cliche. Ditto John Lithgow, who's terrific as the Discovery One's designer, and the great Bob Balaban as Hal's programmer. Because yes, Hal is back in the movie.
I'm sorry for the delay. My voice recognition circuits are not completely restored, although as you can see, they are improving.
And in fact, probably the biggest get of the film was that not only would Keir Delay be back to play Dave Bauman, but Douglas Rain was going to come back and revoice Hal once again. Now, one of the big changes in the sequel is that Hal is now kind of a good guy, with some dialogue explaining that Hal was reprogrammed by meddling White House spies, and that now he's been cleared of his bad wiring, he's a benevolent figure. In fact, he's almost presented as this kind of Christ-like figure in the end, as he kind of sacrifices himself to save everyone.
And if I don't proceed with the launch?
Then the Leonov and everybody in it could be destroyed.
It's a nice twist, and it would have been easy for Hyams to use Hal as, a villain again and turn it into a generic thriller, and that's something he avoids. Hal really is the most heroic character in the movie in some ways. They also go light on the classical music, of course, which was one of the defining things of 2001, opting for an electronic score by David Shire, which, although dated, is pretty good. All in all, this movie is a lot more Apollo 13 than 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I really like that it does its own thing. Now, there are some really, really nice moments in this movie that depict the gradual warming of the relationships between the Russian and American crews, and there's two in particular that really kind of, are quite emotional for a movie like this. One is the part in the movie where a dangerous maneuver is happening, Roy Scheider's taking refuge, and a tearful cosmonaut comes in because she basically just wants somebody to hold her. I thought this was a really nice moment, and also devoid of any romance, despite the fact that the cosmonaut's actually pretty good looking. And there's also a great scene with John Lithgow's character as he's kind of panicking while doing a spacewalk and is saved by a Russian astronaut. Moments like these really kind of elevate the film, in my opinion. So, 2010 is actually pretty easy to see. It's out on Blu-ray and digital HD, and it looks a heck of a lot better than it ever did when I watched it on VHS over and over again in the 80s and 90s. Now, Peter Hyams is a very interesting director, and he's one of our favorites here at The Best Movie You Never Saw. I've talked about a lot of his movies in the past, including Running Scared, which was his follow-up to this with Gregory Hines and Billy Crystal, and I've always thought that he was an excellent journeyman director. And it's interesting to hear Quentin Tarantino and Roger Avary pay repeated tribute to him on the new Video Archives podcast as they reviewed a couple of his movies, including Busting and The Relic, which Tarantino seems to think is completely underrated. He's generally regarded as something of a journeyman due to the fact that he's opted to mostly shoot studio programmers, but I don't know. I mean, he wrote a lot of these movies, and he also always served as his DP. He's a really good director of photography as well, and he shot a lot of his son John Hyams' movies. And John Hyams, for the record, is also an excellent director. Some of Peter Hyams' movies are excellent, such as Running Scared or Outland. Some of them are pretty terrible, including perhaps the worst Ray Bradbury adaptation ever, A Sound of Thunder. But 2010 belongs with, I think, probably his best movie, Capricorn One, as an example of him as a top-shelf Hollywood director. Again, this isn't anywhere near the level of a Stanley Kubrick film, but it's much better than it had any right to be, and it's worth checking out for the curious fan who can separate it from the original.
Goodbye, Dr. Chandra.
On the last edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, we took a look at Peter Hyams' 2010, his sequel to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and were impressed by how many people seemed to really enjoy the movie and remembered it well. It got me to thinking, Peter Hyams really is an underrated journeyman director, and a lot of his movies have kind of been featured in this column before, including Running Scared, and I was trying to think of other movies of his that I really like that don't really get their due. One that I've always enjoyed is Capricorn One from 1978, which is kind of a conspiracy theory movie about astronauts. But another one that is shamefully underrated is Outland from 1981, starring Sean Connery as a marshal on Jupiter's moon. So it's this week's Best Movie You Never Saw.
Think it over.
Let me tell you what you're dealing with here. I run a franchise. The company hires me to dig as much ore as possible out of this hellhole. My hookers are clean, some of them are good looking. My booze is in water. The workers are happy. When they dig more ore, the company's happy. When the company's happy, I'm happy.
On Io, Jupiter's moon, miners have begun randomly committing suicide in gruesome ways. This is chalked up to their grueling working conditions, but the outpost's new marshal, William O'Neill, becomes convinced that something else is afoot. Soon he discovers the deadly truth, that the miners are being given stimulants with the nasty side effect that causes psychosis. His pursuit of the truth lands him on the hit list of the outpost's general director, Shepard, who hires professional hitmen to deal with the pesky marshal. Knowing that skilled gunmen are on their way, and without anyone to turn to, O'Neill waits to face the men alone. So basically, this movie is a science fiction version of High Noon, and it stars Sean Connery in the role that Gary Cooper played, as the lone marshal facing off against deadly adversaries.
You do have a flair for the dramatic.
Peter Boyle co-stars as the outpost general director, Shepard, who's kind of this white-collar criminal.
He's an asshole. He's a very powerful asshole. Don't mess with him.
And then there's Francis Sternhagen as the outpost doctor, who seems to be the only ally that Connery has.
Bingo.
It has an amazing musical score by Jerry Goldsmith, and it's a pretty cool little movie. So, in the early 1980s, nobody was really doing westerns anymore, and Peter Hyams, according to Empire magazine, really had his heart set on the genre. But he decided that all he would have to do was basically to make the movie about the next frontier, which is, of course, space. So he ended up making kind of a space western, and he managed to get Sean Connery to sign on to it. Now, Outland did indeed come along at kind of a rough time in Sean Connery's career. After leaving the James Bond series with Diamonds Are Forever in 1971, Connery had managed a slew of kind of respectable hits, including Sidney Lumet's The Anderson Tapes, John Huston's The Man Who Would Be King, and another really underrated movie, The Wind and the Lion. However, there were also more than a few really pricey flops, like Richard Lester's Cuba, which was a box office disaster just a couple of years before Outland. And even good movies like The Great Train Robbery, which was actually directed by Michael Crichton, the author, really kind of underperformed at the box office. Thus, he decided to experiment with a genre that had eluded him up to this point, sci-fi.
I just hope that I can justify your confidence.
You see, science fiction was all the rage in the late 70s and early 80s, thanks to Star Wars. But it was the film Alien that perhaps had the biggest impact on Outland, with Peter Hyams writing and directing, which could have almost been set in the same universe, with heartless company CEOs put upon blue-collar workers in space and a general lived-in aesthetic.
Cut the garbage and get back to work.
However, of course, the movie that played an even bigger role in Outland's trip to the big screen was High Noon, with the last act of the film virtually making it a remake, albeit a sci-fi tinged one.
What are you at? You.
And the result was a cool flick that really should have caught on at the box office, but only managed to gross about $17 million, which is not a disaster for 1981, but also was far from making it a hit.
That's a lot of crap.
So here's something interesting. Back when I was in high school, I actually wrote, directed, and starred in a remake of Outland. Let me explain. For my French class, we were asked to do short movies with camcorders. This was 1999, by the way. And having recently seen it as a midnight movie on the Canadian Space Channel, I decided to adjust Outland to a high school setting. Basically, instead of minors getting drugs to overperform, students were getting them. Most importantly, it allowed me to be Sean Connery, a childhood hero of mine. Plus, the year was 1999, so no one would have known that I actually stole the story from a 1981 movie that, of course, stole the story from High Noon. And what's even more interesting is that later on that summer, a movie came out called Disturbing Behavior, which basically was the same story that I had done. I just had no idea. 1 A+ and 20 years later, I still have a soft spot for Peter Hyams' entertaining Outland. It's always been a tad obscure, having come along just a few years before Sean Connery hit his stride as a middle-aged superstar. Back then, he was kind of in limbo, with the public still strongly associating him with James Bond, something he was only ever really able to shake off after winning an Oscar for The Untouchables. It took him kind of ditching the hairpiece and embracing middle age that really made him catch on. He's perfectly cast here, though, as the Gary Cooper-style space marshal. He has a great director in Peter Hyams, who is just coming off the underrated Capricorn One, and would go on to do, of course, 2010, just a few years later. This is one of 2 movies he made with Connery, and he always managed to get the star's vulnerable side out between this and The Presidio, which I think are the only 2 movies I've ever seen in which Sean Connery actually cries.
You know, the hookers here are nice. Sometimes they can help you when you're lonely.
Now, Peter Hyams gave a great interview to a website that I really like called Money into Light, which is by this author named Paul Rowlands, who always interviews kind of these old-timers and gets really interesting quotes out of them. And what Peter Hyams said to him about Sean Connery was kind of cool. He said, basically, that Connery was a top professional and that the only way you could ever get in trouble with Sean is if you're not honest. If you're straight and if he asks you a question and you go, I don't know, or I don't agree, you're okay, but you can't bullshit him. You're making one of the biggest mistakes you'll ever make in your life if you try that. And my process with Sean was having to prove myself and get his confidence as a filmmaker. It took a while. He used to say hello boy when we first started. Then our relationship changed and would be hello cock. I love him. So, Sean Connery, of course, is perfect as the square-jawed, straight-shooting cowboy archetype. However, Hyams gives him some much-needed shading, such as the fact that his stubbornness has all but ruined his career.
You got a big mouth. That's why you send from one toilet to the next.
Landing him on the inhospitable rock Io, which is bad enough that his wife abandons him in the first act, taking their son with them. It gives him pathos. All these miners are making these huge salaries because they're doing such hazardous work, he's not even getting the special pay. But the problem with Outland is the same problem that High Noon had. Never for a second do you believe that Peter Boyle's hired thugs are any threat to Sean Connery.
What is it with guys like you? I mean, if you were such a goddamn super cop, what are you doing on a company mining operation like Io?
Who's maybe the toughest action star of all time. Heck, by the time they show up, Connery's already been through the ringer and there's no doubt that he's gonna dispatch all of the goons with relative ease. And indeed, he pretty much kills all 3 of them without a problem. The only one that gives him any kind of fight, really, is the surprise villain at the end that shouldn't surprise anyone, who's actually played by Clark Peters from The Wire. He lived in England at the time. The supporting cast in this one is particularly strong, if unusual for a movie like this. Peter Boyle, who's now mostly known for comedic roles, is the heavy. Boyle, of course, was actually known for dramas back then, having famously starred in the movie Joe. He never overplays the part, rather acting like a frustrated manager resigned to the realities of his job. He doesn't want to kill anyone, but he will if he has to, as long as he doesn't have to get his hands dirty, that is. But the film is all but stolen by Francis Sternhagen as the moon's alcoholic, washed-up doctor.
Are you the new marshal?
Yes.
I got an alibi. I got 4 people who swear they were playing poker with me.
I've never heard that one before. That's really funny.
A role that was originally written for a man, but one she nails, having really good interplay with Sean Connery. They start at each other's throats, but you feel their mutual grudging respect build up throughout the film. In some ways, she's kind of like the Grace Kelly of this movie because she's the one that comes along and saves him at the end of the film, even though there's no romantic interest between them. It's also worth noting that the technical credits in this one are top-notch, with really good special effects for the era, some pretty atmospheric lensing by Steven Goldblatt, who is a really good cinematographer, but the story behind this is that Goldblatt didn't actually really shoot a lot of the movie. Peter Hyams himself kind of took it over because it carries his distinct look. This is something that Hyams would do. They hired Goldblatt. Goldblatt was just kind of left to his own devices while Hyams himself essentially took over. The movie also has a really good score by the late, great Jerry Goldsmith. Now, Outland actually is packed with a ton of action, and it has a really cool show-stopping foot chase throughout the space station that culminates in a hand-to-hand scrap between Connery and one of Boyle's drug runners. Hyams really had a good knack for shooting chase sequences. There's also a really good one in the Presidio, and this is pretty good stuff. Outland, of course, is available on Blu-ray and digitally on iTunes, Google Play, Max, but one warning, avoid the old DVD version of the movie that came out in the late 90s. It was one of the first DVDs to ever get released, and it sports a horrible transfer. You're better off getting a VHS tape of the movie, honestly. So Outland is a forgotten gem in both Sean Connery and Peter Hyams' respective filmographies, but it's a really nifty little sci-fi action flick, and especially worth checking out if you're a fan of genre movies from the era. So, give it a look.
Zero,